Welcome back to the deep dive. We are doing something a little different today.
Yeah, quite different.
Usually when we talk about the end of empires, you picture, you know, burning cities, invading armies,
Decisive battle.
right? The whole Hollywood version of history. But today, we are looking at one of the biggest geopolitical events of the 20th century.
The fall of the Soviet Union.
Exactly. And we are framing it not as a war, but as a massive systemic engineering failure.
It's really a story about mechanics. We're diving into AP European History Topic 9.7, and the sources here paint a picture of a machine that simply stopped working.
It wasn't blown up from the outside.
No, the gears just ground to a halt.
So we have a stack of historical analyses on the collapse of the Soviet Empire and a new Europe. And our mission today is to figure out how a superpower that looked terrifyingly permanent on the outside, I mean, this was half the world order.
Right, the ultimate rival.
Yeah, how it was actually dissolving from the inside out.
Yeah, exactly. We often focus on the finale, the flags coming down, the maps changing in 1991. But the sources suggest we need to look at the engine room.
The underlying causes.
Yes. We need to understand the economic rot that started decades earlier and the specific, almost accidental ways that the attempted fixes, specifically Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, actually accelerated the crash.
There's some details in here that honestly shocked me. We are going to get into how the USSR, this supposed rival to the US, was quietly dependent on American farmers just to keep its population from starving.
Which is a detail that really undermines that whole superpower narrative.
Completely. And how a single bureaucratic mistake at a press conference might have been the actual trigger for the Berlin Wall coming down.
It's a wild story of unintended consequences.
It really is.
Right.
So let's get into the machinery. To understand the collapse, the sources say we have to go back to the era of Leonid Brezhnev.
Right.
This is the period from 1964 to 1982.
Historians call this the era of stagnation. And that word stagnation, it feels passive, right? Like water sitting in a pond.
Yeah, just kind of doing nothing.
But in a geopolitical context, stagnation is active decay.
Oh.
Under Brezhnev, the Soviet Union reached military parity with the U.S. They had the nukes, they had the tanks.
But internally,
the economy was grinding to a halt.
let's drill down into that economic failure, because I think most people understand the concept of a planned economy in the abstract,
Yes.
and that the government controls things.
Sure.
But what did that actually look like on the ground? Why was it failing so badly compared to the West?
It really comes down to how decisions are made. In a market economy, you have millions of decentralized signals, prices, and they tell you what people want.
Supply and demand.
Exactly. If you want jeans, the price goes up, companies see a profit, and they make more jeans, it's automatic. But the Soviet system rejected that.
Right.
They had a massive central agency in Moscow called Gosplan.
Gosplan! That sounds like a villain's headquarters from a spy movie.
It basically was a massive bureaucracy, just tens of thousands of economists and party officials. And these bureaucrats had to decide exactly how many pairs of shoes, how many tons of steel, liters of milk, tractors.
For the entire empire.
For the entire empire.
Yeah.
Years in advance.
That just sounds impossible to manage. How can a guy in an office in Moscow know how many shoes a village in Siberia needs next year?
You can't. And that is the problem. It led to incredible bureaucratic bloat. By the 70s and 80s, the system was so complex that it couldn't adapt. But the deeper issue the sources highlight is the incentive structure.
Or rather, the lack of one.
Right.
This is the worker malaise that the texts mention, right?
Yes. Think about it. In a capitalist system, ideally, if you invent a better mousetrap or work twice as hard as the guy next to you, you get rich. Or at least you get a promotion.
It was a reward.
Exactly. But in the Soviet collective system, your reward was effectively fixed. If you worked harder, you got the same ration. If you innovated, you might even be punished for disrupting the central plan.
So the rational move for a worker is just to do the bare minimum.
Precisely. It created this pervasive culture of mediocrity. There is a famous Soviet joke from that era. They pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work.
Wow.
It wasn't just laziness, though. It was logical self-preservation. But this led to chronic shortages and just terrible quality goods. There were stories in the sources of factories producing chandeliers that were too heavy to actually hang from ceilings.
Wait, why would they make them too heavy?
Because the central plan measured their output by the weight of the material used. Heavier chandeliers met the quota faster.
That is a perfect example of why central planning fails. You incentivize weight, you get heavy, useless chandeliers.
Right.
But you can live without a chandelier. You can't live without food. And this seems to be where the system really hit a wall.
The agricultural crisis. This is the aha moment, the smoking gun.
Tell us about that.
Well, the Soviet Union has vast land, obviously, but the geography isn't ideal for farming. Short growing seasons, bad soil in a lot of places. But the collective farm system made it exponentially worse because, again, no incentives for the farmers.
And then nature intervened.
The 1972 drought. It was an absolute catastrophe. The harvest failed across the board. Now, in a functioning system, you might have reserves or trade partners to fall back on.
But the Soviet Union was facing potential famine.
They were.
So the superpower that is actively threatening the West with nuclear annihilation has to do what? They can't exactly ask their satellite states in Eastern Europe because they're broke too?
No, they had to quietly call up their archenemy, the United States.
This is the part that blows my mind, the Great Grain Robbery, as it was called in the U.S. press.
It was a massive deal. The Soviets purchased about $750 million worth of grain from the U.S. But the scale and the financing are what really matter here. They didn't have the cash.
So they bought it on credit.
They bought it on credit.
And how long was that credit supposed to last them?
The credit allowance was designed to cover their import needs for 3 full years.
Okay.
They burned through the entire 3-year allowance in a single month.
1 month. That implies a level of desperation that they were trying very, very hard to hide from the rest of the world.
It totally exposed that the system was hollow. They couldn't feed their own people without help from the very capitalists they swore to destroy.
Yeah.
It was a massive humiliation, but it's kept relatively quiet internally because, of course, they controlled the media.
So you have this rotting hull of a ship. Brezhnev dies in 1982. You have a couple of short-lived leaders, Andropov and Chernenko, who basically die immediately after taking office.
Right.
And then in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev enters the scene.
And the mood changes instantly. Gorbachev is young, comparatively. He is 54, he's energetic, and unlike the hardliners, he recognizes that the ship is sinking.
He sees the rot.
He looks at the stagnation, the corruption, the reliance on foreign grain, and he decides that to save communism, he has to fix it.
That is a key distinction I want to make sure we nail down for the listener. Because he wasn't a secret capitalist, right? He wasn't trying to destroy the Soviet Union.
No, absolutely not. The sources are clear.
Right.
He was a true believer in socialism. He just thought Stalinism and the heavy bureaucracy had ruined it. He wanted to return to a purer Leninism.
He thought he could modernize it.
He thought he could make it competitive with the West. He really thought he was the surgeon saving the patient.
So he introduces his 2 famous pillars. We hear these words all the time in history class, but let's define them properly so you can really understand the shift. Perestroika and glasnost.
Let's take perestroika first. It translates to restructuring. This was his economic fix. He tried to introduce limited market mechanisms.
Like what?
Well, he allowed state enterprises to determine their own output levels based on demand, not just following the central plan blindly. He even allowed for small private businesses, which they called cooperatives.
Because he's basically trying to inject a little bit of capitalism to wake the patient up.
Exactly. He was trying to solve that incentive problem we just talked about. He wanted people to actually care about their work again.
Okay, and the second pillar, glasnost.
Glasnost means openness or voice. This was political. Gorbachev believed that the economy was failing because of corruption, and corruption thrived because of secrecy.
Makes sense.
So he thought, if I let people criticize the local bureaucrats, we can root out the bad apples.
So free speech as a tool for efficiency, not necessarily free speech for the sake of liberty like we think of it, but just to make the system work better.
Yes. He loosened censorship, he released political dissidents like Andrei Sakharov, and he allowed for open debate in the media. He genuinely thought that people would criticize the bad bureaucrats, but still fundamentally support the Communist Party.
On paper, this sounds rational, fix the economy, clean up the politics. So why did it backfire so spectacularly?
Because he entirely underestimated the level of anger. When you give people who have been silenced for 70 years the right to speak, they don't just complain about the manager at the local factory or the potholes in the road.
They go all the way to the top.
They question the legitimacy of the entire regime.
And there was a specific event that really tested this new openness, right? The Chernobyl disaster in 1986.
This is the turning point for public trust. When the nuclear reactor exploded, the old Soviet instinct kicked in immediately. Deny, hide, cut the phone lines. They didn't even tell their own people in nearby cities to evacuate right away.
But the radiation cloud didn't care about borders or censorship.
Right. Scientists in Sweden detected high radiation levels on their shoes before the Soviets admitted anything to the world. The secret was out.
So Gorbachev is forced to actually use glasnost,
He was. He eventually allowed the Soviet media to report on the disaster honestly, provided daily communications.
which was unprecedented for them.
It was. But think about the effect on the listener. Instead of the people saying, oh, thank you for being honest, they said, wait a minute. You built a cheap, dangerous reactor, you cut corners on safety, and you poisoned our children.
Right. The transparency didn't build trust at all. It just confirmed the public's worst fears about the government's total incompetence.
It shattered the illusion of the all-powerful protective state. It revealed them as reckless and weak.
And once that fear of the state is damaged, the glue holding the empire together starts to dissolve.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the forces of disintegration.
Yes.
We need to talk about the empire part of the Soviet Union because it wasn't just Russia. It was a collection of republics with very different histories and ethnicities.
Exactly. You had Ukrainians, Georgians, Kazakhs, Lithuanians, huge diversity. For decades, ethnic nationalism was brutally suppressed by the KGB and the threat of the Gulag.
But under glasnost.
You can suddenly organize, you can print pamphlets, you can gather in the public square.
And the sources mention this flared up violently in the south, right?
Yes, specifically in the Caucasus, Armenia and Azerbaijan. They started fighting over territory. In Georgia, there were massive protests against Russification. They didn't just want better economic conditions anymore. They wanted their nations back. They wanted autonomy.
So Gorbachev has these internal fires burning everywhere. But then he makes a foreign policy decision in 1989 regarding the Eastern Bloc, Poland, East Germany, Hungary. And it seems suicidal in retrospect. He ends the Brezhnev Doctrine.
This is arguably the most critical geopolitical pivot in the whole story.
Uh,
The Brezhnev Doctrine was the unspoken rule of the Cold War.
yeah.
If a communist government in Eastern Europe is threatened by democracy or protests, the Soviet tanks roll in.
We saw it in Hungary in '56.
And Prague in '68.
It was the ultimate guarantee. Stay communist or else.
But Gorbachev looked at the budget.
Huh.
Maintaining that massive military presence across Eastern Europe was bankrupting them. Plus, remember, he was a reformer. He genuinely believed that these countries would choose socialism if given the chance.
Oh, wow.
So he announced, and this was humorously called the Sinatra Doctrine by the West, that these countries could do it their way, like the Frank Sinatra song.
That is incredible. He basically told the satellite states, you are on your own. The tanks aren't coming. It's like the police announcing they are going on a permanent vacation.
He thought he was being a benevolent partner. In reality, he was removing the bolt from the prison door. The local communist leaders in Poland and East Germany were terrified. They knew their power didn't come from the voters. It rested entirely on the threat of Soviet steel.
And without that threat of force, the dominoes start falling immediately. 1989, the year of miracles.
It starts in Poland. They had the strongest opposition movement, Solidarity, led by Lech Walesa.
Yeah.
It was a trade union movement, which is deeply ironic if you think about it. Workers fighting a worker state.
And because of the new rules, the Polish government had to negotiate with them.
Yes. Gorbachev allows them to hold an election, a semi-free election. The communists guaranteed themselves a certain number of seats, but they allowed the opposition to run for the rest. They thought, we control the TV, the press, the jobs. We will win easily.
And what happened?
It was a massacre at the polls. Solidarity won virtually every single contested seat. It was a total, undeniable rejection of the communist system.
This is the moment I want to pause on, because in the past, this is exactly when the tanks would roll.
And the world held its breath. Everyone expected the violent crackdown. But because of Gorbachev's new doctrine, nothing happened. The Soviets stayed in their barracks.
That silence was deafening. It signaled to every other unhappy population in Eastern Europe, hey, it's over.
Exactly. It was a blueprint. If Poland can do it, why can't we? Hungary opens its borders to Austria. Czechoslovakia has the Velvet Revolution. But the big one, the symbolic heart of the Cold War, is East Germany.
The Berlin Wall, erected in 1961, the ultimate symbol of the Iron Curtain.
The situation there was incredibly tense. Huge protests in Leipzig and Berlin. The East German government was in total chaos. The hardline leader, Honecker, had just been forced out, and this leads to one of the most incredible oops moments in recorded history.
The press conference, right. I love the story because it shows how fragile these massive totalitarian systems really are.
Yes. November 9, 1989, a party official named Gunter Schabowski is given a piece of paper. It's supposed to announce a gradual, highly controlled loosening of travel restrictions. You apply for a visa, wait a few weeks, maybe get approved to visit the West, but Chbosky hasn't read the memo properly before going on air.
He is just winging it on live TV.
A reporter asks him, when does this take effect? Chbosky looks at his notes, looks confused, shrugs, and says, as far as I know, effective immediately, without delay.
Which is definitely not the plan.
Not at all. It's meant to be a slow bureaucratic process. But thousands of East Berliners heard the word immediately on the evening news, and they just rushed the border crossings.
And the border guards, they have no new orders.
They call their superiors, but nobody answers because the leadership is in absolute shock. So the guards have thousands of people demanding to cross. They have two choices: open fire and start a massacre, or open the gate.
And they open the gate.
They opened the gate. People flooded through. They started climbing the wall, hacking at it with hammers and chisels. It was a giant party. The Iron Curtain didn't fall because of a missile strike. It fell because of internal pressure, a bureaucratic miscommunication, and the refusal of guards to shoot their own people.
That image of the wall coming down paved the way for German reunification. But let's zoom out for a second. The wall is down, Eastern Europe is free. But the Soviet Union itself, the USSR, is still technically there.
For a short time. But the momentum was unstoppable by then. The internal republics, Ukraine, the Baltics, Belarus, they saw what happened in Europe and said, we are next.
There was one last gasp, though, wasn't there? A coup attempt.
Yes, in August 1991, the hardliners, the old-school communists, they kidnapped Gorbachev and tried to seize power to stop the reforms. But it failed miserably because the army refused to shoot the civilian protesters in Moscow. The people had tasted freedom, and they were not going back to the old way.
And the final end comes on Christmas Day, 1991.
The Soviet flag is lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The Russian tricolor goes up. The Soviet Union, the other superpower, legally ceases to exist, dissolved.
And we get the new map, a massive geopolitical restructuring.
The Cold War ends instantly.
Yeah.
The U.S. is left as the sole superpower. Germany is unified into a single nation again.
And we see the split of other nations. Czechoslovakia splits into the Czech Republic and Slovakia.
The Velvet Divorce, very peaceful. They just agreed it wasn't working and shook hands.
But contrast that with Yugoslavia.
A profound tragedy. Yugoslavia wasn't technically Soviet. They were non-aligned, but they were a communist federation that lost its unifying glue at the same time. Without the strongman Tito or the Cold War structure keeping them together, it dissolved into horrific, ethnically defined violence and war. It really showed the dark side of that unleashed nationalism.
And economically, all these newly independent countries pivot hard. They want Levi's, they want McDonald's, they want the EU.
It was a massive rush to the West. The European Union eventually expanded eastward, absorbing many of these former communist states. They wanted to integrate and lock in Western-style democracy and capitalism so they could never slide back.
When you look at this entire timeline, from the desperate grain deal in '72 to the total collapse in '91, it is less than 20 years. That is incredibly fast in historical terms.
Blindingly fast. Empires usually take centuries to decline. This one evaporated.
So when you step back and look at the system failure theory we started with, what is the key takeaway you want the listener to hold on to?
I think it's that the collapse wasn't caused by Gorbachev's reforms. It was revealed by them. The economic inefficiency, the lies, the lack of incentives we talked about, it was deep in the foundation. Gorbachev opened the windows to let in some fresh air, thinking it would make the house healthier.
Great.
But the storm outside was so strong and the house was so weak that the whole thing just blew down.
It is a profound lesson in the fragility of authoritarianism. It looks incredibly strong right up until you stop forcing people to pretend it works.
And that leaves us with a provocative thought to end on, something for you to mull over. We often assume that if a dictatorship just lightens up a bit, it can survive and improve. But the Soviet example suggests the exact opposite. It suggests that freedom acts like a solvent. Once you introduce a little bit of political or economic freedom into a system built on total control, it doesn't stabilize it, it dissolves it.
Can a totalitarian system ever truly reform itself without collapsing? Or is freedom the inevitable solvent that destroys authoritarian control?
That is the question history asks.
A heavy, fascinating thought to wrap up on. That's our deep dive into the fall of the Soviet Empire and the new Europe. Thanks for exploring the sources with us, and we will catch you on the next one.